privilege of introducing Professor Bob Keiter tonight. He is the Wallace Stegner Professor of Law, the University Distinguished Professor, and the founding director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land, Resources, and the Environment at University of Utah's S.J. Quinney College of Law. His books include Keeping Faith with Nature, Ecosystems, Democracy, and America's Public Lands, as well as The Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, Redefining America's Wilderness Heritage, as well as, of course, his most recent book, To Conserve Unimpaired, The Evolution of the National Park Idea. Tonight, he'll draw from that book to review how our notion of nature conservation has evolved over the past century, and also to reflect on future decisions for our national parks and other protected lands, which of course feels like an especially important topic tonight. As always, I want to thank the Summit County RAP Tax for supporting our lecture series here at Swaner. It makes events like this possible. And a final note, hold your questions till the end until you can. We've set aside time for questions and a discussion after Professor Keiter speaks for about 45 minutes. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to you, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. Let me thank the Swaner Nature Center for the chance to come and talk about this important topic. Let me give a disclaimer. The talk that I'm giving tonight was prepared before the last 24 hours. So we'll take that into account. I also should note that when we talk about conservation in terms of the national parks or our public lands generally, one of my colleagues many years ago had what I thought was a great word of wisdom on that score, and that is that these are public lands, but they're also political lands. So politics inevitably plays into and shapes what we protect, how we protect it, and whether or not we protect it. So there are other factors that go into these kinds of decisions. I'll talk about those as we go forward, but let me just provide that sort of opening remark. The talk is in part generated from the book that I published a couple of years ago that I'll mention, Conserve Unimpaired, that focuses on the national park idea. The talk will come out in two parts. I'll spend the first roughly half of it talking about the different concept or idea of a national park that has been part of our experience and how it has evolved over time, which in turn I think tells us a lot about where we are with nature conservation across our public lands, and provides us some insight as to the future of nature conservation and preservation efforts on the public lands. I'll be a little bit formal for just a moment, and then I'll be a little more freewheeling as we work through the slides here. As I have it here, Lord James Bryce, the British ambassador to the United States in the early 1900s, made the statement, the national park is the best idea America ever had. Wallace Stegner, not too long after that, came up with his own version of basically the same point. And indeed, it is. And it's been repeatedly observed throughout the 20th century that this is a fact. So our national parks are not only legally protected nature reserves, but they're also much beloved settings reflected in visitation figures, which regularly now exceed, in the last several years, 300 million visitors annually. That's roughly as many people as we have in this country. The national park idea, though, is also shrouded in controversy. And it's really not just a single idea, but it's an amalgam of ideas that have evolved over time as we've tried to define and manage appropriately these places. From the beginning, we've regarded national parks as islands or enclaves for nature conservation. Think of Yellowstone, Rocky Mountain National Park, Canyonlands, and places where wild nature reigns supreme. But this really has not been true from the outset. and I'm going to suggest it's even less true today. The parks are and always have been connected to the surrounding landscapes and the nearby human communities. And this is a fact that accounts for many of the changes and the controversies that have regularly beset our national parks. What is a national park? I've got several different images here on the screen, along with a quotation from the National Park Service Organic Act, a piece of legislation that's now 100 years old, that sets the basic management standard for how we go about taking care of these nature reserves. As you can see from the photos, they're all images that we associate with the national park, but they're all quite different images. I'm going to go through and suggest 8 different principal ideas that have shaped the parks. And I also, let me jump back for a second, I also probably should note that the Organic Act has not been changed in 100 years. So it has been the basic piece, or at least this portion of the Organic Act, let me be clear, has not changed. This has been the basic standard under which we manage these special places. So in the beginning, the parks were basically, let me make sure I get the right point. There it is. Wilderness areas, or wilderness sanctuaries, with very little human presence. Certainly there was some Native American presence, but not much of a human presence. In short order, and this is a photo of Yellowstone in the 1870s, from, I think it was a Washburn expedition, if I recall correctly, that within 30 years you had Old Faithful Lodge, roads, and a whole set of infrastructure to accommodate visitors and people. And ultimately you had passage of the Wilderness Act in 1964, which defined another type of protected land, and many of our national parks, but by no means all of the major national parks, have had portions of the landscape designated as wilderness. But we think about wilderness as places that are untrammeled by man, retain their primeval character. Think of Grand Canyon National Park, and I apologize, we had trouble getting everything on the screen here. But it clearly is influenced by things, by the presence of visitors wanting to experience it. Here you have the raft going down the Colorado River, a motorized raft. Some are motorized, some are oar powered. The presence of motors is entirely incompatible with the notion of wilderness. You also have a number of activities occurring, or beginning at least, outside of the park that influence the park, including the upstream Glen Canyon Dam, which has dramatically altered the ecology of the Colorado River as it flows through the park. Air tour overflights and distant power plants. The bottom part of that photo will show you a power plant. Wilderness-like areas, but impacted by what's happening around the park. A tourist destination. Tourism in the wild here. We, early on, Stephen Mather, the first director of the National Park Service, encouraged people to come. He enlisted the railroads, the automobile associations, and ultimately people came. Such that the Park Service was soon promoting its, not overtly promoting itself, but suggesting, at least internally, that it often was dealing with windshield tourism, or ultimately Edward Abbey's term, industrial tourism, as visitors continued to come into these also wilderness-like settings that we were preserving for the purpose of nature. And here you have a sense of how that visitation has evolved over time. In excess of 300 million today. Back at the beginning, 250,000 in terms of near the beginning of the national park system. You have an image from the entrance into Yosemite on a weekend that same image plays out pretty regularly these days, I'm told, at the entrance to Arches National Park. A wilderness, a pleasure ground, or a destination, parks as playgrounds, places for recreation. Certainly, again, Southern Pacific promoting Crater Lake as Oregon's mountain playground, raising the question of what is appropriate use or recreational activity within the national parks. Is this the type of recreational activity that is appropriate in these settings, or is more sort of solitary backcountry recreation suggested here? Early on, again, the Park Service promoted the visitation and use of recreational use of the parks. The Lane Letter is sort of a Bible for interpreting the Organic Act. It was sent by Secretary of the Interior Lane to the Director of the National Park Service 2 years after the Organic Act was adopted by Congress. By the 1930s, Newton Drury, head of the Redwoods League, was referring to the Park Service as the Super Department of Recreation. I should add that the concerns that were being expressed within parts of the conservation community helped to generate the momentum for passage of the Wilderness Act, ultimately in 1964. Commercial commodity. We don't normally think of parks in this way, but certainly nature is on sale, if you think about it, in a national park setting. Concessionaires have an interest in promoting visitation and selling their product, whether it's rooms or food or gasoline or other things. Early on, in order to do that at Camp Curry in Yosemite, we had the Firefall. You all heard about that? Oops, got it. Where employees of the Curry Company nightly would climb up on Glacier Point there above the fall and light a bonfire. And the visitors would gather at the base, or near the base of the fall, and after it got dark, they'd shove the bonfire off the top of the fall to have a sort of thrilling experience for the visitors. And of course, again, the National Park Service promoted the presence of concessions within the park run by the private sector, which of course has a profit motive as opposed to necessarily the public interest at park. And when we think of parks as commercial commodities, it's not just the concessionaires who can have a significant influence on Park Service management policy, but it's also the surrounding communities, or the gateway communities. And here I have images of Gatlinburg, Tennessee, Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, Dollywood, which is just a few miles further west of Gatlinburg, if you've ever been there, outside of Great Smoky Mountains National Park at the west entrance. Estes Park outside of Rocky Mountain National Park. And the question inevitably arises with the gateway communities: is the park a anchor tenant? Is it a meddlesome neighbor? Or are there opportunities to work together to harmonize what's available outside of the parks in terms of within the gateway communities and type of activities that are promoted there, as opposed to the sort of glittery boardwalk, Coney Island type atmosphere that prevails at Gatlinburg, or are there other more sedate, more consistent with the park idea notions of how a gateway community might proceed and interact with the park. Beyond the commercial commodity, going back to the beginning, parks in many instances were, if not occupied permanently, at least visited regularly by Native Americans long before they became parks. And in fact, the first suggestion of the concept of a national park came in 1832, and the historians consistently cite this, when the artist and author George Chapman ventured up the Missouri River and encountered the wave of settlement moving west the impact that this wave of settlement was having on both the landscape but also the native tribes that were being encountered, and he urged the creation of a national park containing man and beast in all the wildness and freshness of their nature's beauty. And here you have Native American presence in Yosemite Valley after the park was established. Ditto, Blackfeet Village in Glacier National Park after it was established in 1910. This relationship between the tribes and the national parks has evolved over time. In many instances, we find reservation lands abutting or near national park boundaries. Sometimes they're harmonious, other times that's not the case, as you see here on the Blackfeet Reservation east of Glacier National Park. What has been proposed, it has yet to come to fruition, but the Park Service, in a significant break from policy, has suggested creation of the first tribal national park in the south unit of Badlands National Park in South Dakota. There's a long story behind that I relate in the book. Suffice it to say at this point that this is an idea that has been embraced by the Park Service and by the tribe. It has yet to come to fruition. There seems to be general consensus that legislation in Congress would probably be necessary for this to come to fruition. You might, in the back of your mind, be thinking, are there parallels here with the Bears Ears National Monument proposal in southeastern Utah? Another concept that we associate with the national parks today, and actually early on, the idea that this is nature's laboratory, that they're places for science, for experimentation, for education. And indeed, the Washburn Expedition in 1870 suggested in its report back to Congress that Yellowstone was probably the greatest laboratory that nature furnishes on the surface of the earth. Ironically, Congress did not respond to that, either in the Yellowstone legislation in 1872 or in the National Parks Organic Act in 1916. Instead, it spoke in terms of, again, visitation and conservation, preservation of wildlife, that sort of thing, but no reference to science. As a result, the Park Service, during roughly the first half century of its existence, engaged in what its own historian has referred to as facade management. It wanted to keep these places looking like beautiful, static, natural scenes. And hence, fires were put out, predators were eliminated, so that, including wolves, so that we would have good animals for people to see and experience in the park, but not bad animals. Again, wolves, cougars, bears, etc. Ultimately, this began to change. The first glimmers of change were in the 30s. In the mid-60s, change came to pass with what's become known as the Leopold Report, named after Alva Leopold's son, Starker Leopold, a professor at University of California, Berkeley, that suggested that parks ought to be managed as vignettes of primitive America, and as a result of that report, which was generated by the elk population and culling controversy on the northern range of Yellowstone National Park, the Park Service began to allow fires to burn, to recognize the important role that predators play, etc. But of course, this shift in policy, allowing predators to roam within the parks, to allow fires to burn, also has implications outside of the parks, as Los Alamos experienced back in the late 1990s with the fire that ran out of control at Bandelier and burned roughly half of the town of Los Alamos, New Mexico. So I think I'm up to 6 at this point, if you've been counting with me. A 7th, whoops, what did I just do? I just hit the wrong button. Did I turn it, what do I hit to turn it back on? I think I hit the off button.
Tech support is on the way.
Okay. I'm sorry. My apologies. Not only do I have minimal electronic skills, my hand-eye coordination is also good. Oh, okay, here we go. So, moving beyond, let me make one final point. In 1998, so now we're almost a century after the passage of the Organic Act, Congress finally added language to the organic legislation governing the Park Service, directing it to manage parks with taking advantage of the highest quality science. So it's nearly a century before science gets explicitly added to the Park Service's mandate for management of these special places. A wildlife reserve. The Organic Act speaks in terms of wildlife conservation. The Park Service was sensitive to wildlife from the beginning, but it wanted to make sure that visitors had the opportunity to experience wildlife, hence the Yosemite Zoo in the early 1920s, where animals were put in cages, the bison ranch at Yellowstone, bear viewing platforms where the bears came to the garbage dumps in the Yellowstone country, and where bison were basically, elk. What did I do? What do I hit here?
Just go later.
That's good.
You have to. It's not a touch screen. It's not nearly that savvy. Takes it a second. There we go.
Okay. And in Yellowstone, where the elk were managed essentially as livestock, were managed within the concept of a specific carrying capacity on the northern range. Again, this is a notion in terms of the preservation and management of wildlife that has evolved, and now basically the management approach is as reflected in the Leopold report. I gave you some of the language there, that a national park should reflect the vignette of primitive America, reflecting a careful and overall scheme to preserve or restore a natural biotic scene, and hence the elk no longer culled in Yellowstone, grizzly bears roaming free, which of course means that they also roam outside of the boundary, as do the elk, and what's necessary to sustain wildlife is potentially impacted by what's going on outside. Bears get into trouble when they go outside park boundaries. This is a photo of the bristlecone pine at the high elevations in Yellowstone. If you're familiar with the grizzly bears' eating habits, the pine nuts from the bristlecone pine are one of 4 principal food sources, and there's about 90% mortality of the bristlecone pine these days due to insect disease and higher temperatures. Think global warming today, which in turn obviously impacts or potentially impacts the bear and the bear population. So these places are, as the title suggests here, imperfect wildlife reserves. That in turn raises the final point, and I've sort of been moving in this direction, the 8th notion of what a national park is today, and that is that it's the vital core of a larger ecosystem. That recognizing that parks are ecological islands subject to modification by activities and conditions in the surrounding area, a quote that comes from the Leopold report in 1963. In 1980, Life published a report that the Park Service did for Congress that demonstrated that the national parks were subject broadly across the system to what were referred to as external threats, things happening outside of the park boundaries, like mines, like energy fields, like timber harvesting, like subdivision development, etc., that were impacting the parks and the ability to conserve nature within the parks and manage them as truly natural type settings. The notion of the vital core of a larger ecosystem is illustrated here in a couple of different maps. Here we have the U.S.-Canadian border in northern Montana, and here you have Glacier National Park, which is regarded as the core area of the larger crown of the continent ecosystem that extends northward up into Alberta, British Columbia, and southward to pick up the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex in northern Montana. Over here, perhaps more familiar to some of you in the room, you have Yellowstone National Park, surrounded by national forests, with the notion that there's a roughly 18 to 20 million acre greater Yellowstone ecosystem that needs to be managed as a whole, recognizing the vital role of the park as the core of that ecosystem. And here I have some images of the South Florida area. This is the southern tip of Florida. Here you have Everglades National Park down at the southernmost tip, influenced directly by drainage, the river of grass, as it's been referred to, flowing the water that flows southward out of Lake Okeechobee, which delivered a sheet of grass that was critical to the ecology of Everglades National Park, interrupted by various diversions and dikes, levees, etc., and ultimately moving toward ecological restoration of that flow, moving north to south at Everglades National Park. Just to quickly provide a sort of a timeline on what I've just gone through, hitting it topically in terms of different ideas, from the creation of Yellowstone to the adoption of the organic legislation for the Park Service, in other words, the early years before there actually was a National Park Service. We see the emergence of the nature preservation movement. Muir is a major figure in that. Yellowstone created the preservation of monumental scenery or aesthetic management or preservation, displacement of Native Americans, the early heritage tourism where Easterners came west on the trains, and protection of wildlife. From the 1916 to the 1960s, the passage of the Organic Act, the creation of the Park Service itself, the tremendous promotion of visitation and growth of the system, this notion of facade management that I alluded to earlier, and in 1964, the passage of the Wilderness Act, which gave other federal agencies at that point in time, namely the U.S. Forest Service and the National Wildlife, or excuse me, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, authorization, responsibility for recommending and ultimately managing wilderness on their lands, the first formal appearance of wilderness. And then from the 60s up to the early part of this century, the incredible tourist invasion of the parks, mass recreation, science emerges, the notion of letting nature take its course, the Leopold Report, and importantly, the passage of new environmental laws and the creation of new conservation systems, the Wilderness Act, I've already referred to it, the Endangered Species Act, Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and the list goes on, including the conservation movement and the development of the concept of ecosystem management. So that's the first half of the talk, gives you a sense of where we've been with national parks, how the idea has evolved. Let me go ahead and move into the second part of the talk, which speaks in terms of parks and the future of nature conservation. Here I've got a diagram, or a map, excuse me, of the various national park units that we have in the United States. You'll notice large units principally in the western part of the United States and Alaska, with a few significantly sized natural units in the eastern part of the country, a couple in the upper Great Lakes. Roughly 85 million acres of land preserved in the system, 59 large natural parks. How has this system evolved? Here I've got a sort of a quick timeline, and the points that I won't bother to read that, you can skim through it if you want. The points I think that are most important are, one, it's evolved more or less haphazardly, ad hoc, as people have taken advantage of opportunities to convince Congress and local congressional delegations, etc., to designate new national parks. There have been spurts of real growth in the system. One would be during the 60s and the mid-70s, 68 new units established in the national park system, part of Richard Nixon's environmental legacy. He really presided over the passage of many of the environmental laws that we take for granted today. And then, of course, the Alaska legislation passed in 1980. We haven't since then had a sort of major push for or adoption of many new large natural units added to the national park system. The other point that's noteworthy is that beginning with the designation of Lake Mead National Recreation Area in southern Nevada, we've seen Congress in terms of the national parks coming up with a lot of different types of designations: national recreation areas, national preserves, national seashores, etc. National heritage areas, that's Blackstone Falls in New England there. But as we think about the future of the system, we have to recognize, as the hitting would show on this if it were showing, that we have, and the parks exist, and not just the parks, but the public lands exist in a changing and fragmented landscape, which is reflected here with a diagram showing the interplay between the boundary of a national park and an advancing subdivision right up to the boundary. This picture, anyone know what this is?
Yellowstone.
This is the western boundary of Yellowstone. This is a few years ago, so it doesn't look quite this way. And on this side, it would be your right. What you're seeing are the clear cuts on the Targhee National Forest, which came right up to the boundary of Yellowstone National Park, not a place that's particularly compatible to elk and other wildlife that migrate and disperse. In fact, the state of Idaho had to shut down elk hunting on the Targhee National Forest in that area for a decade in the aftermath of some of the overharvesting that was going on at the time. And of course, here you have images of the glaciers in Glacier National Park. Back, I forget the dates of that, but that's probably around the turn of the beginning of the 20th century up until today. Obvious response to warming climate and temperatures. Additionally, today, one of the other concerns that is very prominent is the presence of energy development, both in terms of conventional fossil fuel activity, oil and gas exploration outside Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, or new energy, alternative energy, solar panels in the Mojave Desert near Death Valley National Park in California. So the landscape is filling up. Society is changing and undergoing changes. More diverse society today. This diagram is a population projections by ethnic diversity by decade, carrying forward. I'm not seeing the exact dates. We run out to 2050, starting in 2010 here. Most significant point, and we heard a lot about this because of the recent election, the gray shows the white population going down, and the pink here, the Hispanic population increasing over that period of time. And of course, another fact that we heard about during the election, this map shows you where everybody lives, or a lot of people live. It's the urbanization of the country, along with the fact that in this era of electronics and technology, the notion that children are not getting outdoors and experiencing nature seems to be a reality, often referred to as nature deficit disorder. Can you see the caption here? The mother with the child is saying, see, this is called the outdoors, and the child is sort of being pushed out the doors, responding, oh, I've seen this level on my video games. What's next in terms of the national park system, in terms of nature conservation generally? And here I've outlined what I think are, and certainly what the conservation community along with the scientific community have promoted as major ideas for protecting nature, undertaking new nature conservation strategies as we move forward. First, and a major part of the approach, take an ecological approach. Make sure that we are protecting all of the different types of ecosystems and the related biodiversity with our parks and other nature reserves. And here I've just included a ecological map that shows various ecoregions mapped on the country. If you overlay where the national parks are on that, you'll see that there's a lot of areas that are unrepresented within the national park system. The scientists have promoted a 3 or 4R strategy for attempting to achieve nature conservation objectives. Pick areas that are representative of these different ecosystems. Make sure there's some redundancy built into the system in case of dramatic events like fires that wipe out entire areas, or earthquakes, floods, etc. Manage for resiliency to make sure that the system can rebound from major hits. Again, think climate change here. And the fourth are cut off here. Think in terms also of restoration and restoring areas that we've already impacted with human activities. Another strategy, major strategy here, the creation of new national parks. There are still areas that might be designated as national parks. This slide, I didn't bother to change it because I think it's sort of telling. I did 2.5, 3 years ago, and things have happened since then. One of the areas I suggested was a possibility was a Maine Woods National Park, and roughly about actually on August 24th, President Obama designated the, it's not called Maine Woods, I'm forgetting the exact name for it, a national monument of 85,000 acres adjacent to Baxter State Park in central Maine, up here, as a new national monument to be managed by the National Park Service. The land gifted to us, the people of the United States, by Roxanne Quimby, one of the co-founders of Burt's Bees, who was a Maine resident who wanted to see some of Maine preserved. The High Allegheny area in West Virginia, this idea has not moved forward. There continues to be conflict over the appropriateness of hunting in that area, with a lot of traditional hunting going on. The San Gabriel Mountains, not a national park, but designated as a national monument by the President under the auspices of the U.S. Forest Service now. The Valles Caldera National Preserve designated, transferred by Congress out of the hands of the U.S. Forest Service a couple of years ago to the National Park Service. It is immediately north of Mandalay National Park and helps to, if you will, build out the conserved lands in that area. There was quite a bit of interest that seems to have died down now of changing ownership or management, excuse me, of Mount St. Helens National Monument in Oregon from the Forest Service to the Park Service, given the Park Service's experience with interpretation of sites like this. Another strategy besides creation of new parks is expanding boundaries of existing parks. It's a little hard to see, but the darker green here is the boundary expansion that Congress mandated back in '94 with the California Desert Protection Act, or not got my dates wrong for that, that expanded Death Valley National Park from being a national monument originally to a much larger national park, such that it has now surpassed Yellowstone as the largest national park in the lower 48. It's roughly 3 million acres. Yellowstone is roughly 2 million acres. And there are additional proposals for other boundary expansions in the California desert area. And of course, President Obama, what was it, roughly a few months ago, designated 3 new national monuments in the area that joined or were quite close to Death Valley and Joshua Tree national parks in the desert area. This should look familiar to us here in Utah. Here you've got Grand Canyon National Park spanning the Colorado River. That's the sort of pink down here. And what's actually happened in this area is we've got what I would refer to as de facto expansion of the park boundaries by virtue of other protected designations. So here on the western side of the park, at the end of the Clinton administration, the Grand Canyon Parashop National Monument was designated, managed by the BLM, but for basically conservation purposes. At the same time, you've got the Vermilion Cliffs National Monument designated up here, east and a bit north of the park. And you've also got lightly developed Native American reservations in the area. And if you go further up the river, interestingly, you begin to have sort of a corridor of conservation with the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, that butts up against Bryce Canyon. That is the Escalante butts up against Bryce Canyon National Park. There's a pretty large conglomeration of basically protected lands all around this corridor on the river. And I didn't even mention Lake Mead National Recreation Area to the west of Grand Canyon National Park. Add to this proposals that I suspect may not come to pass to create for the president before he leaves office to designate a greater Grand Canyon National Monument to protect on some of these national forest lands and BLM lands against uranium mining that has been proposed. The proposals for roughly 1 million acre national monument. Likewise, here we've got Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park. Again, toward the end of the Clinton administration, new national monuments created on Forest Service lands adjacent to the park, expanding the protected area. This dates back a ways, but you have Yellowstone National Park here, and if you take the darker area, are designated wilderness areas, both in Montana and Wyoming, and in fact over in Idaho, down here the Jedediah Smith. And you'll notice the park is rimmed on 3 sides by wilderness areas, effectively expanding the conserved and protected areas of the park. One of the other concepts that has come to the fore in recent years is the notion that wildlife are not going to stay within the park. There are traditional migration patterns that occur, and one of the most promising developments has occurred in the Yellowstone country with creation of what's known as the Path of the Pronghorn migration corridor that crosses several different types of lands, and the various agencies and landowners manage to come together to piece this protected corridor together. Here in Grand Teton National Park, the pronghorn spend their summers, and then they head south through the Bridger Teton National Park, which for the first time in any national forest had amended its forest plan to designate and protect a wildlife corridor. At this point where you see the cross-hatching, the antelope encounter private ranch lands. The local land trust managed to acquire conservation easements that's led to the removal of some of these fences that create barriers, enabling the critters to traverse the private ranch lands here, at which point they hit the highway that connects Pinedale with Jackson, Wyoming. The Wyoming Highway Department put in the first major wildlife overpass in the Yellowstone area, roughly 50 yards wide. The photos cut off, so you only get a little sense of it there. And then at that point, the antelope bump into Bureau of Land Management lands and a major oil field, Pinedale Anticline. And the BLM protected key movement corridors there with what's called an ACEC, an Area of Critical Environmental Concern designation that precluded further energy development in those areas. A pretty major accomplishment across this larger landscape to create the wildlife corridor, again known as the Path of the Pronghorn. So corridors become an important part as we think ahead of larger landscapes and conservation on them. And along with that, what has come to the fore today over the last dozen years or so, sort of an outgrowth of the 1990s ecosystem management movement, has been an idea of landscape management, that we need to look not just at the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but we need to look at the larger landscape that includes other nearby protected areas like the Selway Salmon Wilderness Complex in central Idaho, the Crown of the Continent ecosystem up here, and to look for ways to link or connect these various protected areas to allow the wildlife to move between the two. In particular, there's concern that it's important for genetic diversity to connect the Yellowstone ecosystem with the Crown of the Continent. Grizzly bear populations, so bears can move back and forth at least occasionally, and we would have the sort of genetic interchange that's necessary for population viability over the long term. Another idea that has come to the fore, and that's the idea of restoration. It sounds like a new idea, but actually if you look back in history, it's not. Some of the major eastern national parks that are key parts of the national park system were created originally out of heavily degraded lands. This is Shenandoah National Park back in the 20s and 30s, which had been farmed, logged, and mined. And this is Shenandoah National Park today. And the area has regenerated largely on its own. The same could be done out in the western landscape, although regeneration would probably take longer here. And I might mention that for those of you familiar with the East, you know there are a lot of national forests in the East, the Midwest, and the South. At the turn of the century, that is turn of the 19th into the 20th century, most of those had been cut over and heavily harvested, and the net result of that was that the watersheds that the forests often served and protected, were in terrible shape. Congress adopted something known as the Weeks Act of 1911 and opened the door for the Forest Service to reacquire those lands, and over the last century the forests have grown back, and we now have areas that are very important conservation areas and recreation areas in that part of the country. Additionally, we need to think in terms of conservation near where people live. We have a concept of a national heritage area that involves joint management between the National Park Service and local communities. We have the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, rimming part of the Los Angeles Basin. We need to get kids outdoors, and bringing parks and other sorts of nature conservation areas into the urban setting is quite important going forward. Again, thinking in terms of the long haul and the political dynamics that are behind any sort of designation, you need constituents. Park Service also is a key agency, and the only federal land management agency that has or engages in education as a regular matter through its interpretive programs. There's been a push recently to add an education mandate to the Organic Act for the National Park Service. And even without that, the park rangers are out there on a regular basis teaching, instructing, introducing children and the rest of us to nature and what it is that they're involved with protecting. So this in turn, I think, leads us to a question of, well, what about, is there something in the larger scheme of things that we ought to be thinking about? And in fact, my recent research has focused on this. If this is a map, obviously, of the western United States, and the green areas here are actually federal lands that are currently in some sort of protected status. National Park, wilderness area, wilderness study area, Forest Service roadless area that some of you may be familiar with, which is an administrative, not a congressional designation. And the red here reflects Bureau of Land Management lands that are largely roadless, potentially eligible for wilderness designation. If you take a look at this, this is pretty extraordinary collection of protected areas. And in fact, I've run some numbers on this, and roughly, actually, let me go ahead and give you a couple of figures quickly. In the wilderness, or in terms of protected lands that fall into the categories that I just mentioned, in total, roughly 300 million acres in the United States. Now, what's deceiving is about half of that is in Alaska. So Alaska is sort of a case of its own, okay? However, that still leaves roughly about 150 million acres. And if you do the math on that, that's 40% of the federal public land system that we currently have in place. And that's including the national forests, the BLM lands, etc., that are in some sort of protected status. And the question that has occurred to me is it time for us to think in terms of creating a national conservation network? That is a congressional designation that would loosely knit together, or try to knit together, all of these protected areas, recognizing individual complexes like the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the Crown of the Continent ecosystem, the Sierra Nevada range, much of which is protected. You get down here into southern Utah, the Colorado River corridor, etc., and instruct the managers of those lands without changing ownership or management that they must and should coordinate their efforts in order to promote nature conservation objectives and ensure that critters have the opportunity to move across the larger landscape. This is a different map that gives you a little different sense. It doesn't have the BLM roadless areas on it, but it does have parks, wilderness areas, national wildlife refuges, Forest Service roadless designations, etc. And again, you get a sense of how many of these areas fall into different types of complexes that might be suitable for this sort of national conservation network. So where are we now? And this slide is in relation principally to the national parks. The Organic Act Conserve on Impaired mandate endures, and I expect it to continue to endure. The ecological sciences are really guiding much of our conservation efforts these days, and the growth of the different systems, including the park system. We no longer entirely leave nature alone. We're engaging in some limited interventions. Climate change may prompt that even more. We've begun to revisit, think here of the Native American experience, the nature-people dichotomy that emerged in the aftermath of the original Leopold report. Collaborative landscape scale planning and management is part of our experience. We've got public engagement and an enhanced educational role for the Park Service and greater awareness of diversity, social justice concerns, and cut off is the notion of bringing nature to where people are, that is more urban parks and more urban nature reserves to get people engaged in nature conservation and make sure we have the next generation of National Park Service, of conservation advocates. At the end, consistent with the theme that I've tried to develop here, Muir comes to mind more than a century ago, and he reminded us that when one tugs on a single thing in nature, it's attached to everything else. Thank you. I'll be happy to.
You started with a comment, and I would like to request that you elaborate your thoughts on the potential ramifications of the upcoming regime change.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to know at this point. One thing that, and I'll just respond quickly. I mean, at the end of the day, I continue to believe, based on study and experience, that politics factors in a major way into these sorts of decisions, whether to save something as a wilderness area or park, that sort of thing. What I was heartened to hear along the way, and this goes back several months, is that our incoming president explicitly said that he did not favor the approach that the state of Utah has taken, that is that the federal lands ought to be returned to the states. He was quite explicit in saying that he thought that they ought to remain in federal ownership. On that particular score, if you're interested, I can elaborate on a little bit more. I've done a good deal of research on that, and the Stegner Center's put out 4 different white papers addressing that particular issue. And the bottom line is that, at least in my judgment as a lawyer, public land scholar, the state does not have a viable legal claim to go to court to secure the lands that were never owned by the state to begin with. But having said that, Congress has the final say over ownership, management of federal lands. Congress can do pretty much whatever Congress wants to do on that score. So I don't think there's a legal claim to the public lands. The political realm, that remains to play out. And on that score, let me not leave you sort of glum on it. I don't know why a congressperson of whatever political persuasion he or she might be would want to relinquish the assets of the federal public lands to a state, whether it's the state of Utah or California or some other state. The revenues just from oil and gas development on the federal lands are the second largest source of revenue to the federal treasury. why would someone from the east want to give up that revenue to Utah or Colorado or whatever state might be interested in. So I don't think it's likely that Congress would go in that direction, but as we have learned, politics can be somewhat unpredictable. Yes.
Taking that just a step further, because as we all know, our public lands are already under assault from our congressional delegation. So leave that absurd idea of giving the lands to the state. Candidly, what are your fears with this new administration just about the whole concept of protecting the public lands?
Well, I haven't thought deeply about that, as you might imagine. But it seems to me, first of all, that the various designations that I've highlighted this evening, are generally secure. There are some administrative designations included in what I related to you, including the National Forest roadless rule that could potentially be reversed by a new administration. The congressional designations would take some sort of congressional act to change the designation. Congress has occasionally altered a national park designation or even decommissioned a national park. It's been quite a while since it's done that. There are very small areas that presented serious management problems when it did it. So I don't think that's likely to happen. I think that the national park system is secure in that it's well loved by the American people. We just celebrated the centennial, and that brought out all kinds of people to the parks. So I don't think there's much concern there. Well, I mentioned the idea that's been floated around for some time now of a new national monument in southeastern Utah, the Bears Ears National Monument. My candid view on that is I think that's a little less likely today than it was before the election. I think there may be some interest in the what's known as the Public Lands Initiative legislation that Representative Bishop introduced that seemed not to have much in the way of political legs under it. There might be some renewed momentum to that legislation. It was less protective in general than the Bears Ears monument proposal. So those are a couple of thoughts. Moving forward, at least based upon what President-elect Trump said during his campaign, I think we can expect to see a pretty significant push toward additional energy development on the public lands. Although I think that will be driven partly by politics, but also by market forces. And there's currently, a pretty substantial amount of oil and gas out there and available, and whether the market forces and price, et cetera, would be sufficient to convince the oil companies to, drill more is an open question. Some likely impact on some of the environmental regulations, clean air, et cetera.
Don't you think that President Obama is more likely to name Bears Ears as a result of?
Well, that's a good question. Maybe I should explain my reasoning if you're interested. The thing that might dissuade the designation of the monument is that he would act under what's known as the Antiquities Act. It was adopted by Congress in 1906. It's a broad delegation of authority, extraordinary, I should add, broad delegation of authority to the president. And you've seen President Clinton and President Obama wield it pretty powerfully, if you will, to designate large areas, grand staircase, 1.7 million acres, etc. That has incurred a lot of political pushback locally here and elsewhere where some of these monuments were designated, such that there have been recurrent bills to repeal or amend the Antiquities Act introduced into Congress. I think the conservation community has felt pretty secure up until this point that they could resist that type of legislation, and in fact they have successfully. But as a result of this current election, we now have a Republican president, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate. And my thinking in terms of suggesting that this may be less likely is that I think the White House will have to make a political calculation as to whether, if they were to make that designation, or other, there's about half a dozen major national monument proposals around the West, or other designations that would incur political wrath locally, whether they would be putting at risk the Antiquities Act and the power that the President has to act under. And that is whether Congress, with this political lineup, would change the law. That's where I'm getting.
But I think there's real serious fear of them doing that regardless, and so why not go for it while we can?
That could be the case. The question is whether or not, this would add fuel to the fire to accomplish that sort of change. Now, I suspect, again, I think looking at this, the whole political calculus there, you have to take into account that the Senate is not, or does not, legislation can still be filibustered in the Senate, and I suspect that the Friends of the Antiquities Act would be prepared to do that. Having said that, there are all kinds of legislative tricks that various congressional folks can employ to try to accomplish that objective, one of which would be an attachment to a must-pass defense authorization bill or something like that, with that type of amendment. So it's not an easy call. I'm not suggesting I'm right. I'm only giving you sort of the other side of the coin on that particular issue.
You mentioned that there was 300 million acres, and half of that was in Alaska, and the other half, and all you showed was a picture of the West.
Right.
Where's the 150 million acres then? How about the East? Why don't they share it too?
Well, there are designated wilderness areas and national parks in the East, but the vast majority of the protected acreage is in the West. That's where you have large federal land holdings, and these designations, park, wilderness, etc., are applied, and monuments are applied only to federal public lands. Neither Congress nor the President has authority to designate privately or state-owned or tribal lands as protected areas. And most of the East was, as you know, settled, converted into private ownership before wilderness legislation was passed and that sort of thing.
Can you see why Utah might be a little bit upset that all this land is being taken away from them?
Well, I can understand why there would be resistance to a protected designation. I wouldn't suggest that the land is being taken away. The land remains in federal ownership as it always has been. It becomes a question of precisely what the land is, if you will, used for, managed for. And there you've got balancing between the questions about where the public interest balance is struck: preservation, utilization, development. As I've suggested, I think 60% roughly of the federal public lands in the West are available for development and use, roughly 40% in some sort of protective status. And I probably should add, as some of you are aware, economists have done a lot of studies suggesting that there is a vibrant tourism recreational economy around the West that is driven by the presence of national parks, wilderness areas, other protected areas, and a lot of communities have built their economic base, if you will, on that as opposed to timber or mining or oil and gas, etc. And the economic argument there is that, one, it's a little easier on the landscape, but two, over the long haul, it can be more sustainable.
There's a huge backlog of maintenance in the parks. Their budgets have been cut over the years. If your staff, they can't keep up with the additional visitation. What do you see as the impact of that on the future of the parks, and especially when we talk about making the parks bigger, better, and joining them with all sorts of great ideas like that?
That is a concern, and there are efforts to address it. There is something known as the Centennial Bill that's pending in Congress that would bring or open the door for private sector donations to the National Park Service, something akin to the relationship between universities and private donors, alumni donors, etc. That would provide an alternative source of revenue in addition to federal appropriations. I think it's incumbent upon Congress to begin to meet the full needs of the park with appropriations. The amount of the budget is pretty modest. And on top of that, in terms of the parks, looking around the room, I think many of us benefit from this. I do. You can still buy at age 62 a senior pass $10 that entitles you to entry into the park for the rest of your life. That's an extraordinary benefit, but it seems inappropriate at a time when budgets are tight, and it seems to me that we ought to be paying something more appropriate for passing that. So, some adjustment in terms of entry fees will also be helpful. Congress has tinkered with that over the years, but I don't think it's made the full set of adjustments that it should, both in terms of entry into the parks and then familiar with the various the recreation pass that is necessary now to access Mill Creek Canyon or Bear Lake Highway to use developed facilities, that sort of thing. So Congress has done a few things in that direction, but there's more than it could.
All right, well, I just wanted to add one thing. Can you take a minute or two and talk about the Swaner Center and what it is you do and the conference you have every spring, describe what you do?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment was established at the University of Utah in the College of Law in the mid-1990s. So we have 20 plus years existence. The Stegner Center today has evolved into, we sort of do three principal things. One, we have done public programming for all of our existence, including an annual symposium. I might mention that the annual symposium this year is on water in the West, late March. It's a day and a half symposium at the College of Law. Secondly, and we do a variety of other public programs ranging from having authors come in and talk about books to people involved in particular conservation issues, making presentations during what we call our new Green Bag series. Secondly, in the last 5 years, we've developed an environmental dispute resolution program where we have provided education, teaching, instruction to lawyers, land managers, others in how to engage in collaborative processes. Those of you familiar with these issues know that that is one of the major approaches that all of the agencies are taking today, is try to get people around the table to minimize controversy at the outset by engaging in collaborative processes. So we do that. We do some publication in that area. We instruct students in that area. And we actually are actively involved in a few collaborations around the state, including a Secretary of the Interior award-winning collaboration on the Escalante watershed down in southern Utah. And then thirdly, we've developed a research program where we provide research services and produce papers, articles, that sort of thing on particular issues of particular currency and concern. Hence, there are 4 white papers, as I mentioned, that we produced addressing this transfer of federal lands issue that the state of Utah has been a major promoter of among the western states. We have other papers out about the role of NEPA in conservation, resource management issues, etc. So those are the 3 principal things that we're engaged with. If you're interested, College of Law website, the Stegner Center, or just Google Law Stegner Center, and you get immediate access to that. I thought about it, I should have passed something around with emails, and we could keep you informed of our programs. Wasn't pressing.
You can leave your info with us at the conference.
Pardon?
People can leave their info with us.
Okay,
at the
I'd be
conference.
happy to take that. Well, again, thank you very much.